Finally, man, all the cards are in. We have them all, the cards. Volodymyr, man, I'm so happy that we're talking because I met you in New York. When was it? Was it back in the summer when we last saw each other?
No, I think it was February 2024.
Yeah, last year.
Yeah.
So almost a year ago?
Yeah, yeah.
And you know I live in Ukraine part-time, so we could have seen each other well before that. Actually, we tried, but you were busy and we kept readjusting the schedule, so you're finally here. So I always ask people before we get into the heavy politics of it all, how are you doing as far as your mental health?
Look, first, Terrell, I'm very happy to be here, and thanks a lot for all that you're doing. It's amazing, and I also wanted to meet you for a very long time, so finally we did it. I think we have, many people in Ukraine, I think they have psychological resilience. Like, we went through so many difficult stages that at some point those things that are unthinkable for others, for us became a new normality. That doesn't mean that we are all okay, like in a peaceful time. So therefore, when everybody asks me how you're doing, I'm saying I'm okay, but with a bit of irony in this. But look, I think there are lots of people who lost their family members and who lost their beloved ones. And you see sometimes people on the streets, you understand they have a mental breakdown. I just seen a man in the metro in a military uniform, and he was behaving as if he has, he's living in a, let's put it in that way, he's living in a different world, like as if he is on the battlefield. I don't know whether it's a real military man or not. So of course there are huge problems, but I think that as if the material, mental material out of which we are created, as if it got even stronger during this time. I would answer in this way.
Yeah, because the benefit, I would say, of living here is that I get to observe things, and particularly when I leave outside of Kyiv, and you do see that resilience, but it's a toll, right? And so when you really have friends and you talk with them, it's really rough. A lot of people are seeking therapy. A lot of people are taking different type of depressants to keep themselves sane. So people are doing all types of stuff to navigate this storm. And so anytime people talk about the resilience of Ukrainians, of course, we obviously see that. But at the end of the day, you all are human beings.
Absolutely. We're not people made out of steel. I mean, we're not mythological creatures. We're just people as everybody else. And therefore, of course, there is a certain firmness that we have in our minds because our history is very, very difficult, that. But of course, it cannot be infinite. We are not cyborgs. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's something that I always like to talk about before I start any conversation when I'm dealing with Ukraine, especially when I'm talking with somebody like you, is to talk about that human toll. Because when I go back home, you see American flags across the country. Ukrainian flags across the country. So definitely the people support Ukraine, regardless of this maniac that we have in the White House, and we're going to get into that. The American people definitely stand with Ukraine overwhelmingly, and that goes across all ethnic groups. Generally speaking, they all support Ukraine. But one of the things I talk about is just how challenging it is for people who live here, and particularly with the men who are constantly being called upon for mobilization efforts, and also dealing with the women who are left behind, and then you're dealing with the constant bombings. And with me, I get used to it. We all hear the same sounds in the morning, and you don't know if they're going to actually hit your building or not. You read about them, the drones, the Shahed drones, and we all get used to the sounds of those. And you hear the explosions, and as much as they startle you, the good news is that those explosions are being intercepted. But you also know that the other type of explosion could be when it actually hits a building, or it hits some critical infrastructure and your electricity goes out. So I let people know that as brave and resilient as Ukrainians are, this human toll is something that no human being should have to carry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mostly care about my kids. and I have 3 children, and of course, well, this is when you hear the sound of a shaheed, everybody knows the sound. So you kind of the first thing you think about is, okay, let's put kids in the corridor instead of their bedroom when they're sleeping, or let's do something. Yeah, this is it. So, but I think you cannot talk about the general experience of the war. I think the experience of the war is very individual, because some people have lost their beloved ones, some people have not. Some people went through the front line, some people have not. Some people went abroad, some people have stayed here, and some people have lost their homes, some people have not lost their homes. So you should be very careful. I think the first rule is to be very careful about the another person's experience, because you cannot just say, okay, I'm living in a country which is going through the war. It's very different. And when you're living in a village that we visited a lot, on the destroyed villages on the front line, like Kamyanko, Dolino, Posad Pokrovsky, or whatever else, is hundreds of totally destroyed villages. It's one thing that you understand that you no longer have a home. Or when you, for example, I've seen a lot of people in the Ukrainian army who come from the occupied territories, now occupied territories. So they literally understand that probably they will never come back, or they will come back. Well, I'm not saying this. They will come back probably, but later. In many years it can happen, like Mariupol, or like Starobilsk, or like Lysychansk, or whatever else. And there are other people who are just living in their homes. Like I'm living in my home. I haven't lost my home. I have friends who lost their homes. So it really, you should be very careful and understand that the other people's experience can be much harder than yours.
Absolutely. So I want to get into this ceasefire that Trump has negotiated with Putin, and according to reports, they brokered a deal that requires Russia to not target critical infrastructure. But we know from last night and this morning that there's obviously no ceasefire, because we continue to hear the shaheeds and the attacks are continuing. So I'm really curious about what you and what Ukrainians here are talking about in regards to Trump's relationship with Putin. I would call it, even at this point, an alliance. It feels like to me that there's a Western front, at least politically and diplomatically, that Trump has opened up against Ukrainians. What do you think about that?
Well, I think either there is this common front, as you say, or Trump is very naive. And I was saying about this for a long time, even before the elections. I have several podcasts on Ukraine World, asking and reflecting and analyzing whether Trump will be able to stop the war. And I was, saying the things that are happening now. For example, if there is a deal with Putin and Putin doesn't follow the deal, what will Trump do? Or Trump wants to get Russia out of from China and make an alliance, and America and Russia against China. This is extremely stupid thought that probably is in his head, because it's impossible. Russia has made its choice. It's not going come back to the West or something like that. So whether it's an alliance or not, I don't know, because there are values, and certainly in the values realm, Trump seems to be very close to Putin, because they both dream about vertical organization of politics. Some people around Trump speak about the monarchy or something like that. So it's a really concept. The major ideologues like J.D. Vance, they're really relying on people who praise Carl Schmitt, and Carl Schmitt is a German philosopher who helped Hitler to get into power. He's one of the best legal philosophers in Germany, but he has this part in his life story, that he helped the Nazis. Why? Because he had the concept of a sovereign who can act in the moments of exception and therefore disregard the law. So I think that both Trump and Musk and some people around him wants precisely that. They don't believe in institutions. They believe in certain voluntarism, the tyrannical voluntarism. And here, of course, they might be very close to Putin. But there are, of course, differences because Putin is basing his idea of power on violence and on institutions that I'm calling it that control the means of destruction. So the KGB, the former KGB, now FSB, the army, the police, what is called siloviki in Russian, while Trump tries to create his, power vertical, I don't know, on big tech, on control over the information space, on something like that. I believe in the American democracy. I frankly think that, there is a stage of shock, of course, in your society, but there are lots of, the society, I hope, is there and it is vivid, and it will be able to at certain point to say no to this new tyranny, and Ukrainian society can share a lot of experience how we actually did not accept the tyrannical overturn, the tyrannical turn on our history, in our history, whereas Russia is forever like that. It based its very idea on this tyrannical approach to politics. But this is values, and on interest, I don't know. Let's see. I think sooner or later, my forecast was that sooner or later, American and Russian interests will be just completely different, and Trump will understand that he cannot really agree with Putin, and therefore the situation will change. But we'll see.
It's interesting you talk about your faith in democracy, and from my standpoint, and I have a lot of conversations with my trainer, who I go to the gym 3 times a week, and when she's not working me out, in between sets we talk about politics, and she says, Terrell, why don't you all have a Maidan at the White House? When Ukrainians, we get angry and upset, we just run to the streets and scream, and we get rid of the person if we don't like them. And I say, I wish that could happen with us, but it doesn't happen for several reasons. One, the last time someone tried to overthrow the government, here it was a revolution, but in the United States, January 6th was a coup attempt. So, in many of the attempts to overthrow the government come as a result of white supremacist violence. If you look at every single case of an attempt to overthrow a government, whether it be national or local, it comes because of white violence against black people attempting to assume some role in power, if it's via electoral politics, usually, or if the country is going in a course that a lot of white people feel that they'll be replaced, then that's when you see it. So we've never, as an American society, been united, black people, white people. It's never, and it's never been the case. And I tell people that American democracy has always been vulnerable. And as far as I'm concerned, even the way that we talk about American democracy doesn't tell the full story because black people have been excluded from it. So my grandparents and people in my family, up until 1970, they all didn't have equal access to the voting box. They literally had to pass a literacy test before they could register to vote. And those people are still alive. And I can call them right now on WhatsApp and they can tell you the stories. And so when everyone had access to the ballot box, that was 1970, which is basically 55 years ago. When we usually celebrate Ukraine after the fall of the Soviet Union, Belarus, the Baltic states, and all the other countries that were colonized by Russia as welcome to democracy. But in reality, we're roughly about 20 years ahead of you all. And so I just think that when people talk to Ukrainians especially, and this is something that's a challenge for me, and we were having a conversation about me being a Black American here, is that my relationship with American democracy is vastly different from everyone else. And so I believe in it just like you. However, it was my people, Black people. Everyone knows Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and all these, but it was so many other people who fought for democracy. And the reality is that you're talking about this vertical style of power that Trump wants. there are so many Americans who also want that with them, because, and it's particularly white MAGA people, because they feel that they will benefit because it will resurrect what that life that occurred before 1970, when certain people had access to rights and certain people didn't. And so we believe it because we fought for it. But I think a lot of people don't appreciate the fact that there are a lot of people in America who don't want that type of democracy that you aspire to, the ones that people in my community fought for.
Look, I agree with you, but I think there are if we take America and if we take, for example, Europe as well, the problem of America and Europe was that there were certain values declared, and then they were not fully observed. So the problem was hypocrisy, right? So you declare certain values. It's like the problems with the ancient Greek democracy, right? Yeah. It's okay, everything is fine, so we're democratic, but excluding women, excluding slaves, excluding non-citizens, the Metacs or whoever else. So the story of democracy is that you proclaim certain values and then you extend them to more and more groups of people. And then, of course, you have problems because, for example, in the American case, I know it very well. It was a hypocritical democracy, not only with regard to the Black Americans, but also with regard to indigenous population, etc. Of course. So the very story of America. I don't want to make any judgment. Of course, I'm not American. And I don't know American history in detail, but I understand that there are some problems in the very basic understanding of the American myth. But the values are there. So the task is, to say, okay, but they're not covering all the people. So there are people who are excluded from that. So let's make it more inclusive. Whereas in this part of the world, Russian Empire and Soviet Union, Russian Empire has never said that they're going to base their politics on the values of democracy. Moreover, the whole 19th century, Russia was saying we are against democracy and we are the major power in Europe which will stop the ideas of the French Revolution. Like the major Russian poet of the 19th century, Fyodor Tuchayev, even wrote an essay in French during the springtime of the People Revolutions in 1848, calling Russia and Revolution, where he was saying that the major enemy of Christianity and all this stuff is revolution, meaning the values of the French Revolution, and Russia is the only force that is able to stop it. So it's basically this role of an authoritarian obstacle to the spread of democracy. Russia accepted this role already in the 19th century. Then it accepted this role in the 20th century with Stalinist version of communism. And then it accepted this role in the 21st century with Putin. So it's not the problem of hypocrisy. It's a problem that they deny the very idea that equality is good, that freedom is good, etc. Therefore, they hate Ukraine for the very fact that they think that Ukrainians are actually will be able to bring these values to Russia.
But what's really interesting about that, and as somebody who's really growing in my knowledge about Ukrainian history, is that you all had democratic principles in your society.
Absolutely.
Right? You had that, and that's something that a lot of people don't know. They always ascribe it to the USSR, but you all were politically distinct in that way.
Look, it's interesting. Some people are even going back to the old cultures which were here. And when I'm saying that, I'm not even referring to our scholars, but there was a recent book by two Davids. I forgot the last names, which is called The Dawn of Everything. And it's a few years ago. And there, among others, analyzed the settlements that we know here as Tripilian culture, which is kind of a fourth millennium before Christ. And they were saying, look, these were the big cities, almost at the same time during the Mesopotamian cities, the big settlements, where you cannot really find the elements of hierarchy. So you cannot find administrative buildings, you cannot find the religious buildings, meaning that there was a level of equality which was unthinkable. So you can even trace these traditions of democracy back to those times. Of course, it will be kind of we don't really know much about this culture because it's archaeology and everything. But then you can say that medieval state here was like a typical medieval state in Europe. So you have city-states, and there was no imperial vertical power. These city-states were competing with each other. So it was like in Germany or with Italy or whatever. And then we had Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which was, I would not say democratic, I would say republican. Not in the American sense of the word, but in old, sense of the political philosophy, res publica, meaning the common thing when not one person is ruling, but several persons are ruling, several forces of power. Then we had a state which was literally called res publica, meaning the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Rzeczpospolita. And only after, let's say, the beginning of the 18th century, when Ukrainians lost the fight against the Russian Tsardom, against the Russian Empire of Peter I, we started to have the imperial power here, the tyrannical power. So the tyrannical power we had 3 centuries. What happened before that for centuries and centuries, it was quite different forms of political organization. And therefore we have this, I do think that we have this tradition, even despite the fact that Ukrainian or proto-Ukrainian statehoods or non-Ukrainian statehoods which were on this territory, on this geography, they were, of course, interrupted. You cannot really have the continuous history of the statehood. But still, the elements of that are certainly not tyrannical, not imperial.
Absolutely. And there was a period, I believe it was at 1919 or 1920, where there was like a 1-year period that there was a democratic, like a presidential society here. I can't
It was 3
year.
years. I mean, starting from 1917 until more or less 1920, 1921. The governments here were changing all the time. So it was just after the First World War, even in the midst of the First World War. And in Russia, you had the coup d'etat by Bolsheviks, by Lenin. And here we had an independent state, and then an independent state, the Western Ukrainian Republic, which also formed itself. So then you can say that we had a statehood history of early modern times, the Cossack state, starting from the mid-17th century up until the early 18th century. And then, of course, we have Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which is called Lithuania, but they were using most probably Proto-Belarusian and Proto-Ukrainian language, and they had the legal corpus, which was coming from the Kiev legal system from the medieval times. And then, of course, we have the glory of this Kiev state, which lasted for several centuries in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, I'm curious about when you went to the U.S. and you were seeing the campaign. I just want to know what your impressions were of our politics, particularly your conversations with Americans. And you said that you kind of foresaw what was going on, what Trump is doing right now. But I'm particularly curious about your interactions with people when you were in the States, and just from a people perspective, what you observe. And it's an open-ended question.
Well, look, I was shocked with this polarization, frankly speaking. And I think that there is a profound difficulty because... But on the other hand, it's not something that lasts forever. Because if you take Ukraine in 2010, when Yanukovych won the election, fair and free election, but Yanukovych won them in 2010, this pro-Russian...
I was here when I saw
pro-Russian dictator. Look, Ukraine was also very much polarized. And I mean, people who were anti-Yanukovych would never speak to people who were pro-Yanukovych. So it was like 2 countries in one. And then now it's gone, this division. So there are other divisions, but I think there is a greater goal in life on the first hand, and the secondly...
Before you go, how did those divisions end? What happened?
Well, the war. So in 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time. And of course, all those people who were pro-Russian, their legitimacy decreased substantially. So if you have, I'm not saying that they're completely gone, but I mean, it's not 50%, it's probably 5%, you know. So if you have a big existential challenge, then people can unite around this challenge. This is one thing. And I think the second thing is that Yanukovych really delegitimized himself a lot by willing to become the major oligarch, the oligarch over the other oligarchs. So kind of to become a tyrant, if you can say, to impose the authoritarian rule. I mean, Ukrainians don't like it, so yeah. So, but at the same time, you know, I think what was wrong in America is that people so much believed that American democracy is irreversible, untouchable, and it is forever. But those of us who, like me, study political philosophy, we know that, look, it was all described many years ago. It was all described by Plato, Aristotle, Polybius, and some other smart people up until Machiavelli. They were saying, look, it's always a cycle. And at a certain moment, democracy degrades into something very nasty. When this happens, when people start considering the democratic values as something that creates only rights but no obligations, that is kind of that you consume as if they're commodities in a grocery shop, you know, that you think that they will exist anyway, and then you are very, very not serious about them. So I do think that democracies in Europe, in America, are in this stage where people just do not appreciate that these values are very fragile. You need to care about them, and when you start, you know, spreading hatred, when you start polarizing society, when you start saying, as you said, that, you know, America is only for the whites, and, you know, the Black Americans are, you know, second class people. Yeah, you start losing it, of course.
You know, it's interesting. I definitely agree about democracy operating in cycles. What's also true is that America has always been polarized. There's never been a point in American history where we have not been racially polarized. In fact, America is a settler colonial state. That's another thing that we don't discuss in the in the world about America, is that it's a settler colonial state. So is Russia. Russia is the land that it occupies is not indigenous to Russian people itself. And we know that just even from the war with many of the people that they round up and put in uniforms to come and kill Ukrainians. These are the people that are coming from the southern regions of Russia and the territories that they've occupied over hundreds of years. We know that. But also America, you brought up the indigenous peoples earlier. Those people are just flat out killed. You talk about somebody that was screwed. Yes, we went through slavery. The indigenous people in the founding of America, those people were just massacred and killed. And there are just so few of them that people don't even talk about them anymore. They're just gone. And my experience comes from being a reporter in the United States. And so I focused on Ukraine full time when the big war started in 2022. But before that, I was covering national politics and local politics. And one of the things that I noticed that when I would go to these red states, the Republican states, I grew up originally in Detroit, Michigan, which is the largest black city in the United States. And now I live in New York because my father is from New York. So my mother's Detroit, my father's Brooklyn. So it's the most urban type of parenting that you can ever have, right? But what I found interesting when I would go to West Virginia and go to Georgia and Mississippi and interview white people, they are so poor. And I felt like these people were in worse circumstances than me, because I had all of the trappings of a large city, even though I dealt with a particular type of racism and redlining that really limited black people's opportunities throughout history. But these white people, I mean, it was outhouse poor, like I have to go and pee in a hole in the ground poor. And these people overwhelmingly vote for the same party year after year after year, and their economic situation does not change. And what it told me was that these people don't care about economics. These people don't even care about the democracy that we're talking about. To them, this is like a highbrow conversation. I'm thoroughly convinced that these people they still have some mourning, some anger about the loss of the Civil War. And I feel like the thing that Trump is doing is that he's telling them that feeling of greatness, he uses the terminology, let's go back to the old days. The old days for us is Jim Crow. When I said we couldn't vote, when my grandmother had to flee her little town in South Carolina because the racism was just too extreme. And so she dealt with people in Detroit where the white people, they were friendly. And by friendly, it meant that they wouldn't call you the N-word or they wouldn't threaten violence against you, but they weren't your friends either. So she was dealing with that. But with Trump, he talks about these days where you can go back and make America great again, which goes back to 50 and 60 years ago when we had some of the most repressive laws in the country that were anti-democratic. And so I definitely agree with you in that we don't appreciate what we have, because I feel like there's one part of the population that desperately wants it because it benefits them. But then there's a lot of people who don't want that type of democracy because they feel like it undermines who they are as a human being, particularly white people. And so that's what I observed just as a journalist talking to people. They didn't talk about economics. I spoke with one person who was saying that I would talk to them about their economic situation. And they would, I don't understand why, they would say, I don't want trans people in the military. Can you imagine? I'm asking people about the price of X. Randomly, they talk about trans people because it plays into this notion that there is some genetic person that's going to come along and replace them. I know it sounds silly, but this is the madness that we're dealing with right now. And, you know, and I talked to, and with the Ukrainians, the way that they talk about you all, anytime I talk to Americans during my reporting about Ukraine, freeloaders, they're taking stuff from us. They're stealing. It's the same way they talk about us as black people. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes, and one also thing that makes a striking parallel is that I think neither Black Americans nor Ukrainians will ever use the phrase "let's make something great again," because we understand that our past is not very good to come back to, because we are thinking about some ideals in the future, and the past does not giving us the big orientation. The best thing the past can give, both to you and to us, is that, as I said, there is a certain set of ideas or values that were not fully implemented because they exclude a lot of people. So let's try to extend this idea to bigger and bigger number of people. But what unites Trump and Putin is precisely this political nostalgia, which is usually a nostalgia about power. It's about power and about in I think the both cases maybe this capacity to use violence, at least in the Russian case. Mm-hmm. So what Putin dreams about is that Russia that was able to commit violence against other nations without any response to that, right? And I mean, very often authoritarian regimes are based upon this political nostalgia. I mean, the obvious example is, of course, the far-right regimes in Europe in 1920s, 1930s. Mussolini was dreaming about coming back to the Roman Empire. And Hitler was dreaming about coming back to the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation of the medieval times. Franco was dreaming about coming back to the big Spanish Empire. So usually what happens is that when, I'm calling it the syndrome of a wounded empire, when empire understands that it is losing its power and it tries to jump back to the glorious times, which for it were the times that when violence was much more permissible. And this is always very unhealthy, because that makes you think about the past much more than about the future, I think. But again, this is what unites us very much, Black Americans and Ukrainians, I think, this very skeptical attitude to the past. Because we see in the past lots of violence. We see in the past exclusion. We might see in the past certain bases to build upon. I also see in the past, Ukrainians were not only, there were victories by Ukrainians, there were heroic acts, there was a huge intellectual tradition. But I will never say, let's make Ukraine great again, because I want to look at the future. I want to implement some ideals and not just come back to something that was before.
Yeah, and that's the thing about our communities, is that we look to the future and we build for the future. And I've always had this belief that when I first came to Ukraine, that what really drew me here was the fact that, and this is going to sound really silly, but I was 20 years old, and it actually wasn't Ukraine. I first went to Georgia. I was 23 years old, actually, Peace Corps. And I would kind of talk with Georgians, hang out with them, and I started learning the language. And some of the guys, they would start talking about what it was like going to Russia to find work. And then they would say that they were called racial slurs. People were referred to them as chorny, which, we all know is black, but in a derogatory way. And, black ass, all these types of things, all these type of foul words in Russian. And the guy was telling me that, yo, man, they treat us like we're black, like you. And it threw me away, because I'm looking at this guy, I'm looking at his skin tone. I'm like, no, you're not, right? But then he had to sit down and really explain it to me. And it was my first time that I was educated about how little I knew about how the term race works outside of America. And so what he was telling me is that the Russians were racializing them. And from that point forward, I made it my goal to educate myself about what oppression looks like outside of my community. And it really empowered me to have better conversations with people, because I'm a professional journalist by training, but quite frankly, people don't look to me about that. They look to me and say, Terrell, you're a black person that comes from this very black environment, but you're in Ukraine and you live in Ukraine and you enjoy Ukraine. And why is that? And I enjoy it because I get to talk to people like you, and we try to make sense of the world. And when the best minds come together, we realize that these oppressive systems, they hurt me and they hurt you. They hurt all of us. And that's what gives me hope. And I feel like when I draw these parallels, it helps people to feel like there's a chance for us to figure out ways that we can live in this world together. And that's far more valuable to me than doing Kremlin politics and understanding what's going on here politically. I could do that. Of course, I have the training link. I could do it. But people look at me in the work that I do in these interviews because they want to learn how they can better communicate with other people. And the number one thing in the news that really resonates with this topic is the 240,000 Ukrainians that Trump is targeting for a possible deportation for no other reason that he wants to. It's very xenophobic. Let's just put it's xenophobia straight up, because the way that he was talking about Ukrainians during the election, he makes up these wild numbers about how much money is being sent to Ukraine, and in reality, it's a little more than $180 billion. And much of that money stays in the United States. So the way that he talks about it is that these suitcases full of money are on airplanes and being brought to Ukraine. And he describes Ukrainians like freeloaders, and that they're lazy, and that they're taking things away from us that belongs to the American people, and that's why they're suffering. And he's speaking to white people. So I find this juxtaposition of Ukrainians who, under typical terms in America, would be perceived as white, but they're definitely not getting white privilege with this threat to deport them in the way that he talks about you all.
Well, that's because he tries to play an easy game, putting the blame for this war on Ukrainians and not on Russians. I think that in Trump, and I tweeted that after this episode in the Oval Office, I think the question is, what is strength? So Trump wants to be strong. But strength for me is the capacity to challenge the stronger and not the capacity to humiliate the weaker. And here I suggest to you two concepts. One is the concept of executioner. So who is executioner? The man who just cuts the hands. I don't know if this is the right word in English, but in Ukrainian we have a word cut. And cut, that was the word that Ukrainians started spontaneously writing on the monuments to Lenin and all the other communist people already in the late 80s. So we are now on Khreshchatyk, on the main street, and then you have Maidan, just a few hundred meters. But in the late 80s, there was a huge monument to Lenin and to other communist leaders. And I remember I was a child at a certain moment, and it was 89 or maybe 1990, before the collapse of the Soviet Union. You had these big inscriptions in white, cut. The same with the monument of Lenin here on Bessarabka and some others. So what cut means? Cut means a person who executes, who cuts the heads of prisoners. The executioner is somebody who commits violence against people who are helpless, who are defenseless. And therefore it's not a big deal, to cut a head of a person who cannot defend itself. Well, I think that there is another concept of strength, and it comes from the ancient Greek mythology, and it's called, the word is known for everybody, it's the word hero. So hero is, in ancient Greek mythology, a person who challenges the stronger. So Heracles challenges the stronger forces, etc. So Trump, instead of challenging the stronger, Putin, and saying, okay, you invaded Ukraine, you're responsible for this, he starts more and more to put the responsibility on Ukraine because it's easier. I mean, it's easier to cut assistance to Ukraine and say, okay, we will punish you on that than to impose more sanctions on Russia. So we will see what happens. But let me just reflect on what you said about race. Russia is certainly a very racist country. And you see that in the attitude to the Caucasian people, to the Central Asian people. You see what is happening on Russian television. You see all those comedy clubs, comedy shows that really humiliate the, let's say, non-Slavic population.
They have words for Ukrainians too.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. But I think there is one element which is very important, which is an addition to that, because empires are not only acting through racism. Because racism, what is racism? Is when you say this group of people is inferior to me because they have another color of skin or whatever. But as they are biologically different, they will never become the same as me. And therefore they will be always ghettoed and, not given the same rights, etc. And European racist empires of the 19th century were based upon this idea. And in American politics, you see that, and in Russian politics as well, with regard to Central Asians, with regard to Siberian people, with regard to Caucasians, etc. But there is another mechanism, and I would call it the mechanism of assimilation. When you don't say this group of people is inferior than mine, and the boundaries between them are, you cannot really are insurmountable. You cannot really cross them. But another logic is the logic of assimilation. When you say that this group of people do not exist because they're same as us. They're not different from us. They're not inferior from us, but they're the same than us. And Russians were using this technology towards other Slavic people who are not, Ukrainians are not different in the color scheme, from ethnic Russians. Belarusians are not different. Poles are not different, etc., etc. But in the minds of the Russian ideology starting from the 19th century was to say that basically Slavs do not exist as nations. All the Slavs, even in the Poles and Slovaks and Czechs, and the idea was that Russia will come over and unite them. As Pushkin said, Pushkin is also a very interesting character because of his origin, and we kind of have a very ambiguous attitude to him. But he said that all the rivers of the Slavic world will collide in the big Russian Sea. So this ideology coming from the 19th century, who actually saying that Ukrainians do not exist and Belarusians do not exist, it's not the attitude of racism, it's the attitude of assimilation. It's not statement that you're different from us, you have another skin color, you will never become the same as us. It's a completely different statement. It's a statement that you will never become different than us, And therefore we are hostages of all this ideology because people say Ukrainians do not exist. Why care about them? You know what I mean? So it's not a question of, sometimes it's a question of hierarchy of beings. It's just a question, but this is not a being. It's not an entity, not a nation.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious about Ukraine's relationship with global South nations. You think about the continent of Africa, India, China, etc. And when the big war started, there wasn't this overwhelming support from a lot of the global South nations. They were either neutral or, in some cases, aligned with Russia to a certain degree, albeit they may say we condemn what happened, but there wasn't this overwhelming support like it was with Europe. And we also remember when the African refugees were fleeing Ukraine and the experience that they were dealing with. I actually reported on that. And and a lot of people said a lot of racist things happened to them in Ukraine, but also in Europe. So just going across into Europe, you had African refugees, even once they entered into Europe, their status was treated differently, and that played a role into how some of these nations felt towards Ukraine. And I'm just curious, what have been your thoughts about these things? Because I know that you followed the news of what's happening with the Global South and these other storylines. Do you feel like Ukraine, there are some areas of improvement that this country can do to better build trust with a lot of these nations that are ambivalent towards it?
Well, it's difficult. On the racism question, I think there is a problem in Ukraine of this. I think that there should be more education on that. But we should also understand that, there is much less experience of this intercultural, interracial communication.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we have students like from the African continent studying medicine or studying some other things. And I think case by case you can study it. The story that I came across is that in one of the villages, the mayor stayed with the group of, and we talked with this mayor, stayed with this group of the people in this village despite the occupation. So I think 80% of the people from this village have gone. It was near Kyiv, and one of those people who stayed was a woman who had a husband from one of the African countries, and he was wounded because of some shelling. And this mayor, despite the threats to his life, was going, I think, through the block posts, through the checkpoints, risking his life to get a doctor and bring to this person. So what does it tell us? It tells us that Well, there is a village. Usually you have more xenophobia in small villages, but there was a Ukrainian woman. She had a husband from one of, I don't remember which one, African country, and they were living okay. So this woman was considering okay to have this kind of relationship, and that would probably mean that the attitude of the people around her was okay. And then when he was wounded, then this mayor was, doing a great job to help him. So you can have lots of stories, lots of different stories. On Global South, I think we have lots in common. Look, I had several podcast conversations on Ukraine World with Brazilians, with people from South Africa, with people from India. We are now publishing every month a text of a Ukrainian writer in Latin America, in several countries of Latin America. So we're trying to reach out, but of course, you cannot pour all your resources there, because what we existentially need right now is Europe, because Europe can help us militarily, financially, politically, etc. We don't know what will happen with America, whether aid will still be there, whether, it's all changing every day. So I do think that there is a big, profound value controversy. So we see the world differently from the current American administration. Let's put it mildly. But then there is a question of interest. So I don't know where this administration will go on that, whether it will cut aid to Ukraine or it will strengthen aid to Ukraine. We don't know. So Global South is very important. I actually don't use this word. I think it's a word that doesn't really have any sense, because there were so many different countries. Even Africa is a very strange world because there are so many different countries there.
The countries and the thousands of ethnicities. Everyone uses it. I'm always trying to debate between whether to use it or not, because there are even people from the continent who use it and some who don't. So it's like a contested term.
Exactly. Yeah. So we don't have a better word for that, but what else can we say it's non-Western world? It's a bad either. Yeah. So we actually prefer talking about, continents, different continents. And here, of course, our resources are not big. You cannot think about every day like, okay, between the Shahed bombings and between, taking care or just logistics of bringing kids to school, because kids, they do not go to school when there are air alert, but every day we have the so-called school mining. We have reports of school mining almost every day.
What's that?
It's like there are guys who call the mayor of my city where I'm living. It's near Kyiv, and say all the schools are mined. So you should take kids away from that.
Like landmine.
Exactly. Yeah, these are reports. Of course, they are not confirmed, but you cannot keep children in the school, right? When you have a report about mining, so the parents come and take kids home, and most probably, I don't know. It like goes, well, not every day, of course, but very often. But my hypothesis is that it's also Russians who are, paying money to some adolescents to call or to send a message.
That's a cruel joke.
Exactly, and to keep police busy, for example, or have a gain against your mental health or whatever. So why I'm saying this, we are trying to do some communication amid of this, chaos, everyday chaos. But as I said, there is lots of, for example, now Pan Ukraine brings a lot of journalists or writers from these countries, from all over the world. We had Brazilians, we had people from South Africa, we had people from India, we had Argentinians. Now we will also have, some press tours. So we're trying to do something, but compared to the funds by the Russian propaganda that is using on these countries, well, it's not easy.
It's not easy, but I also tell people when they ask me about this, because I get asked a lot because on social media and elsewhere, I'm like the one black person who lives here. I tell them, look, racism is everywhere.
Yeah.
And you can't escape it. Anti-blackness is everywhere. What I don't like is when people try to make Ukraine the epicenter of racism when literally I have a fascist in my country's government, a man who is extremely anti-black. And I tell people that in many ways I feel safer here than I do back home. And I'm not saying that for hyperbole. I genuinely mean it. I don't have to worry about some MAGA extremists walking around and some extreme neo-Nazis. And that's another funny thing. People talk about the neo-Nazis. I come here on my own funds. I would have to be psychotic to come to Ukraine.
Yeah.
Looking how I look.
You look great.
Well, thank you. But I look like somebody that a Nazi would want to attack. I wouldn't come here and travel around this country.
Absolutely.
If that was, it makes no sense. And so, but that's what I tell people. Yes, I mean, if you want to talk about how we can deal with racism and all these other things in general, of course, every country, including my own, needs to have a seat at the table when we talk about that. But there's just this overwhelming disinformation machine that's targeting Ukraine. And I'm like, we know why, but it's frustrating because it's just an unsophisticated way of looking at things because you guys don't elect fascists and extremists into your government. America has. We have a fascist that was elected by an overwhelming number of people. Ukraine doesn't. And so I always respond that way. And quite frankly, if there was some major war in the United States, this type of racism that Africans and people were experiencing, it would happen in the States too. Because when people are competing for resources and the worst in people come out everywhere. What would happen here, it would happen in the States. And we see these roundups of people who are Haitians. We see the Ukrainians are in it. And so I just tell people, you have this laser focus on Ukraine, but you're not even looking at what's going on in your own country. And if you really talk to them about it like that, then the whole conversation at the end about the Nazis in Ukraine and the racists of Ukraine is just ridiculous because it's everywhere.
Yes, and I can tell you that Ukraine is really a very multi-ethnic country right now because, for example, I'm teaching at Kyiv Mahila Academy, and I can tell you that every year in my group there are people with Crimean Tatar last names, with the Georgian or Azerbaijani or Uzbek or Kazakh last names. We have very prominent people in our politics who come from Afghanistan. I mean, the Nayem family. And
I know who they are, yeah.
Yeah, and not only in politics, but in cultural life. So two brothers and a sister. And we have Muslims, very important role of Kirimli, of Crimean Tatars. We have very important role of course, Jews and ethnic Jews. So, and frankly speaking, I mean, Ukraine has to go to a certain level of multiculturalism. Why? Because we have deep problems of demography because of this war. We need to be open. Otherwise, and these people who have, let's say, how to put it, non-ethnic Ukrainian origins, they speak perfect Ukrainian because most probably they came here in the 1990s when, for example, in Georgia you had problems, in Armenia, Azerbaijan you had wars actually. Some people, I hear Arabic a lot, for example, in Kyiv, but in Odessa, for example. So people come here from other countries of the world. Why? Because Ukraine was developing so beautifully in the 2000s, and lots of people were saying, okay, this is the place of the new economic growth. And I think Russia felt it too, and therefore it started the war. But I do think that after the war, Ukraine will attract many people from many other places. And the fact that it is quite anarchic as a country, I hope we will make bureaucracy less. We will diminish our bureaucracy and make really a country that is much more oriented on freedom, political, economic, whatever, will attract a lot of people. And I'm sure there will be people from the African continent or from the Asian continent. So we also need to learn how to live together. If Ukrainians do not learn, so we have no other choice because of the demography and because of the birth rate and because of lots of dead people and etc. So I think we need to also prepare ourselves and educate people a lot.
Yeah. And eventually, as I grow the podcast and everything, I want these to be translated into Ukrainian because I feel like people need to hear this.
AI will help. What do you think?
Well,
translation?
Thank you. Yeah, really. Because I think people need to hear these conversations. And I know that so much attention is focused on governments, but the reason why I wanted to talk to you is that I know that you had the mindset to have this conversation.
Of course.
And even because we, like the people who are the artists, the journalists, those are the people that authoritarians try to kill first.
Yeah.
Because we're the ones that think about how can we make this world work and function together. And so us having this conversation, we're thinking through these problems. And when you were talking about the demography issue, that was something I'm thinking about. I looked at one of my one of my friends actually who works in politics. He was telling me that there are fewer than 30 million people here. That shocked me. I thought there was at least 33, 34 million people here. He said it's fewer than 30 million people.
And we were 50 after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yeah. So it's a great depopulation.
Yeah, and like all countries, Germany is dealing with it as well, which is why the fascists are raising bloody hell. And you saw J.D. Vance was talking about the white Christendom, right? And in regards to Germany, and he was saying that the immigrants coming in are just reorienting and changing the face of Europe, which he's basically saying is that all these Muslims and all these Africans are coming in Trump's words about America, poisoning the blood of this land. And the reality is that it's immigration is really what makes societies work.
Yes, but I think it's also important that we start to think about how to give birth to children, more, because all the liberal discourse just distorted. Well, I'm a liberal, but I see the problems in the liberal discourse as well, as if, it completely failed to argue that family is good. And family values is not only the conservatives have the right to talk about families. No, I'm a liberal. I have 3 children. I think that, family, the good family, where there is no violence, where there are more or less equal and horizontal relations, is the place where you can create conditions for children and for young people to grow and to have the confidence in their future. And so liberals should also talk about families, about demography, about making children, about immigration, and about all this stuff.
My last question to you is, I need your advice on how we in America can deal with Trump and his attack on our democracy. As a Ukrainian, as a nation that had 2 revolutions in 10 years, what can we learn from you?
So never give up. I think this is the key thing, and I think we learn on our stubbornness. So Ukrainians are quite stubborn in the way how we don't accept certain things. So I understand that people who are against tyranny in America are shocked right now, and they feel helpless. Maybe they feel weak. But you need to overcome this feeling as fast as possible, and to believe in yourself and be stubborn, and act. So people need to start acting and not just complaining. I think this is the key thing.
Act, and don't complain.